I studied as an economist, and then I started my career in the UK as a civil servant, focused on international development and climate change. Over 12 years, through my career and my work and personal life, I traveled back to Kenya frequently to see family, but also to do work, but also to over 40 other countries. And I traveled especially to poorer countries where I constantly saw change and impact. Change influenced by one particular actor, China. Some people were positive about it, some people were negative about it. It was very mixed. Yet, in my work on international development in the UK, and with the country governments and the general members of the public, I realized that very few of these people knew how to deal with China and even understood who they're dealing with. So I felt this was too important to leave to fate. So I started to look to work in China and got what was a perfect introductory role, heading up a special department set up in the United Nations Development Programme to work specifically on China and the world. It was a great job. The UN is really trusted in China. I had a great research team. But it was also inflexible and bureaucratic, everything we think about the UN. It had high overheads, and in some cases it felt like it didn't have the mandate to directly support African stakeholders, for example, in their private sector dealings with China. So after 2 years in that role, and also after becoming a mother, which is a game-changing experience, I decided to jump into the private sector and set up my own consultancy, Development Reimagined. At Development Reimagined, our mission is to bring new solutions to the complexities of global poverty reduction and sustainable development. We draw from experience from all over the world, including China, and we also pilot new ideas. We design projects, we evaluate projects, we help implement them for and on behalf of other organizations. But the reason I'm here is that while we do this broader international development work, we have created a strong speciality on China-Africa cooperation. Our clients range from African governments who are trying to get more investors or tourists into their countries, to African businesses and brands who are looking to enter the Chinese market. And the other way around, we help Chinese businesses and organizations deliver their aid better and Chinese businesses to understand and operate better in African countries. Much of our public work has been cited in publications, The Economist, the FT, Quartz Africa, CGTN, but also locally, Cape Town Argus most recently. And in some cases, we even partner with media houses to publish new data or work that we have done. So now you know my story and what locus I have on this topic. But before I go into the 3 suggestions for carving out our distinct African perspective on China and the West, I want to get an idea from you, dear audience, about what you think, the kind of buzzwords that you hear and maybe have written about, communicated about with regard to China's role in the world and Africa more specifically. So this is a wake-up time, okay? So can people shout out some buzzwords that they think about China and Africa?
Buzzwords?
Okay, okay, I heard neocolonizer. Anything else? Okay, recolonization, infrastructure, any others? Surveillance, okay, interesting.
Debt?
Louder, debt, oh yes, good one. Louder? Okay, I also hear like fake products and things like that. Anything else? Yeah, fake. Fraudulent. Okay, this is for, yeah, okay, all right. Okay, this is really helpful. And oh, you're really getting going now. Okay. Well, okay, the reason I asked you about that is because what's interesting about your responses is about how diverse they are. They're also very broad. They're also, quite a lot of them are very kind of negative, concerned feeling. And that's typical. It fits very well. Whenever I go to different African countries, this is exactly the kind of discussion that we have. But what I also want to kind of test with you guys is that they're not necessarily African, and that's not me being rude to you at all. But it's also part of our challenge, how we speak for ourselves about China. So let me give you an example. Take the issue of debt. Somebody mentioned that one. Yeah. The African perspective on debt is definitely diverse, but it also includes the fact that African and most other poorer countries around the world need to raise external debt and finance from other countries or private lenders to climb out of poverty, tackle climate change, and meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Now, the African Development Bank estimates that the need for this external help, so that's beyond what we can internally raise through taxes, all this sort of thing. So they've estimated how much our economies are projected to grow, and then they've said, actually, there's a financing gap, how much is it? And this is what they've come up. Just for infrastructure, it's in the billions of US dollars a year. And to be exact, it's 63 billion US dollars per year and above. Now, earlier this morning, Moki Makura from Gates Foundation mentioned that Gates has spent 40 billion US dollars over their lifetime. So I'm just giving you a comparison. Loans and grants from the entire development community, that's World Bank, OECD countries, for all problems and not just infrastructure, in 2018 was 153 billion US dollars, and less than 20 of that went to African countries. So I think it's obvious that African countries, if they do not raise some of their finance needs through grants or debt from elsewhere, they will have no chance of meeting those goals. So when an article starts from the point of view that countries are potentially facing a new debt crisis, my view is, well, maybe not. They're facing a financing gap. And are they and their partners doing enough to plug that gap? And are they spending the money that they have as productively as possible? Are they growing from the debt that they're taking? And if not, why not? And are there other projects that they should be doing instead? It's not about cutting off the finance due to some arbitrary limit. Indeed, does anyone know the African country with the highest debt to GDP ratio in Africa? So this is another wake-up time. Any thoughts on the country with the highest debt to GDP ratio, as in seems like the most indebted in Africa? Zimbabwe, Zambia? No. Any others? South Africa? Somebody say South Africa? No, definitely not South Africa. Rwanda? No. Rwanda's actually really super careful about debt. Okay, I'll put your minds to rest. It is Mauritius. Yes, yeah, it's Mauritius. Not the country that we typically associate with poverty or being behind. That is the country with the highest debt to GDP ratio on our continent. So we have to think more carefully about these things. We have to speak for ourselves about setting the agenda. And there are many other issues, from trade to things like scholarships, issues around neocolonialism and so on. Real, vital, and African perspective and narrative is yet to emerge and dominate. And it needs to. Because if China does not hear our perspective, it may actually turn the tap off rather than encourage leaders to be more selective in the infrastructure projects that they're putting forward for debt financing. If China doesn't hear our perspective, it will actually push us to make the same mistakes that were made in the 1980s with structural adjustment, imposing liberalizing policies on our countries that we absolutely could not and cannot manage, pushing poverty levels up rather than down. So how do we carve out this space? So I'm afraid I can't talk about your business models. I can't talk about how you use social media. But I can talk about how you pick topics substantively and write about them. I can also talk about how you engage your clients on some of these issues. As somebody that uses the media and works with clients around the world, and in some cases, very frustratedly. So here are those 3 ideas that I promised at the beginning. The first one is that we need to be very careful with our language. Frantz Fanon, the great Pan-Africanist, once said, "To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture." I agree, and I extend his point to the use of specific words. I believe the language, the words that we use, are important in shaping our thinking, and they have real consequences. That's why, for example, in our firm, we have a policy to rarely, if possible, never say Africa, because Africa is not a country, and each of the 55 countries on the continent are very diverse. It's also why we avoid saying China does this or China believes that, because the country is not one actor. There are Chinese private sector organizations, there are state-owned companies, there's the Chinese government, the Communist Party, there are Chinese non-governmental organizations and Chinese think tanks and academia, and like in all countries, they act and think differently, yes. The government might want all Chinese actors to align around the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, but it's a framework. It's like federal law in some of our countries, or devolution. There's a lot of devolution and room for interpretation at the local level, so we have to bear that in mind. It's also why we avoid the use of the term the West, and that's for 2 reasons. First, when it's used, it's usually some kind of amalgamation of Europe, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, sometimes Russia. But that's both selective and very ahistorical. The regions and countries that I've just mentioned all have had very different types of engagement with slavery and colonialism on our continent in the past. And they now have strongly differing policies on issues like multilateralism, on immigration, and others. And so they're not one either. Second, it also often sets up a bipolar world of an emerging China that is itself taking on this imperial nature, being threatening, the sorts of things you guys were talking about, through hard, soft, people talk about sharp power now. But a bipolar world, by its very nature, really disempowers African, Caribbean, South American, Asian and Pacific countries who don't fit in, who may not have the same views, and who don't have the same experiences as everyone else. And they don't have the same experiences as China, and they don't have the same experiences as the West. The world is not bipolar. So my first suggestion is that we remove all of these terms from our vocabulary, or only use them very selectively when it really makes sense. Like today, we're talking about Speak for Africa, it's okay. The second suggestion is this one. Always contextualize and compare China and other international actors. Every story happens within a broader context, broader trends. One way of doing this contextualization is looking at history. Another one is providing information about another similar country's actions and experience. Here's one example. Our clients often ask us about trade with China. which is an increasingly critical component of any country's business development strategy. Many are trying to get access to the Chinese market. Even my own country, Kenya, has recently negotiated to have avocados come into China. But that's another story. I won't go into that right now. But while we do, as a firm, support them in these negotiations, we also realize that China's trade patterns exist within other groups and potentially can also use as a means to lobby and advocate for their own positions and interests. So we started to look into this, into the trade patterns between the African continent and the largest 20 countries in the world known as the G20. And we realized to our surprise that nobody had looked at this before. But it was fascinating and important for us to all be aware of. For example, I think somebody was talking about fake and cheap Chinese products coming into Africa, right? Well, China's not the only one that exports a lot to African countries. For these 20 countries as a whole, the largest economies in the world, for every dollar of African exports to those countries, the value, $1.4, comes back in. We buy from them as imports. It's not just a Chinese issue. Of all the G20 countries, there's just one country that imports more from 50% of the African countries. So there's not one that there's no G20 country that imports more from any of the countries, right? First of all. But one actually has a trade deficit with the majority of the African countries. So again, wake up time. Any ideas which country that is? And I'll give you a clue. It's not China and it's not the US. Any of the biggest countries in the world, which one imports more from 50% of African countries? From over 50% of African countries, and it exports back to them. Not the UK. Russia? No. France? Not India. Not South Africa. Not France. We're getting close, actually, with Brazil. It's actually Mexico. Yeah. Yeah, good on Mexico, eh? Okay, there we go. But actually, the amount of their trade is quite small. So you've got to kind of balance that out. But fundamentally, what it means is that Africa is not a trade priority for most of these countries, right? Together, the G20 import 36 more times more goods from everywhere else in the world than they import from Africa. Yeah, 36. Now, I could go on about these results and also talk about whose fault it is, right? Is it African countries who are not manufacturing enough? They're not opening up their business environments enough? They've got terrible corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Or is it the other side? Is it China who's closed? Is it the rest of the world who's closed? But I'm not going to go into that. What I am going to say, though, is that we are currently the world is talking about Africa's growth and transformation potential right now. You know, 55 African countries have come together to put a free trade agreement in place, the biggest free trade agreement in the world. And African countries like Rwanda, like Ethiopia, have been opening up their business environments, building industrial parks, investing in infrastructure. We see it, to attract that investment. But our data shows that the global policy environment for trade with African countries is harsh. And it's hardly shifted since before the Doha round was initiated back in 2001. In some cases, it has worsened, with preferential trade agreements being used as political tools rather than enablers, or being disregarded through things like use of non-tariff barriers, and both for agricultural products and also value-added products. It's the job of communications professionals to enlighten the world, Africans in particular, on these issues. And if we understand them, we can do something about them. We can get our governments to do something about them. And of course, comms organizations, this is a good thing for you. People will come back to you, to your sources as a result. Context matters. So, third and final suggestion. Build cross-country capacity and understanding, especially of China. The fact is, and increasingly unlike many other international partners out there, this is where China is different. There are very few cases where the Chinese government officially provides information which is broken down by country about how it is interacting with African countries. They usually, when they publish data, they publish it as a whole. They'll say, this is our trade balance with Africa, or this sort of thing. They never break it down. There are a few instances. Confucius Institutes, for example, is one. We found that data, and we did some analysis and a great piece on it last year. But in other cases, most cases, it's not there. It's also hard to summarize some of the cross-country information and cross-country experiences. I'll give you an example. Back in 2012, I was in Addis to help design a private sector development program. And it was at the same time that the light rail project, which was being built by a Chinese contractor, was about to begin. Anybody been on that light rail project? Another wake-up moment? Light rail project in Ethiopia? Okay, all right, I must be the only one. Anyway, it's quite nice. But when I was in my hotel reading the morning paper at that point, I saw an article about a 5-year schedule for how many Ethiopians and Chinese people would be employed and involved in that project. So in the first year, it said that there would be more Chinese people, and by the 5th year, there'd be hardly any, and the majority of laborers would be Ethiopian. And I was pretty impressed at this approach, not just at that approach, but also just the transparency of it. Literally numbers like 576 or whatever, really very detailed. Then I also remember, maybe 2 years later, big protests in Kenya over jobs and local content with regards to another rail project, the Standard Gauge Railway, where clearly the Kenyan government had not negotiated the same kinds of terms. And eventually, the Kenyan government renegotiated, and they came up with a simple formula for the overall number of Kenyans to be hired as over the entire lifetime of the project. Now, my point is not to say that one approach is better than the other, but it's more that, to my knowledge, there was no articles, no exchange of information about the best practice or the different practices of these types of standards across the continent. There was no reporting about when the Kenya project was done, what had been done in Ethiopia, what had been done in Nigeria, etc., etc. And it applies to so many areas. Interest rates on loans, debt levels, cancellation, environmental standards, public-private partnership, and it also applies to other projects with other partners. The US, for example, what's their local hiring policy? Do we know? What's negotiated in those contracts? The point of exploring these cross-country comparisons is not to create rifts behind any of the countries and China or any other partners. Each African country knows that it's special, that it's different, and requires a different relationship. That's absolutely key. But it's helpful to create a bit of friendly competition and an exchange of ideas, fundamentally, and experience on how to improve and deepen the relationship with China for the benefit, to shift the balance of the win-win towards the African countries. I've seen some great progress on this since then. Quartz Africa are doing really interesting pieces. They did something on air traffic recently, but definitely there's space for a great deal more, and potentially even as collaborations between media houses and journalists across the continent. It would really be great. Ladies and gentlemen, communications professionals, PR professionals, brand professionals from all over the world, from Africa, I was asked to answer the question, can Africa rise to the play? My answer is definitely yes. And I've shared 3 practical ways that I hope you will find useful going forwards. Be careful with our language, be deliberate with it, look at the context, and also make cross-country comparisons. Those are ideas for how Africa can, but it's also not about can. With over 400 million people still in abject poverty in our continent, in cities and in the countryside, in 2019, Africa has to rise to the play with China, with the UK, with the US, with all of its development partners. So let's start communicating about our world in a way that actually enables that. Where there is no East, there is no West. There actually just needs to be all of us working together to make this emergence finally happen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Anna Ryder. Thank you so much. Anna, while we have you still on stage, I bet we have 1 or 2 questions for Anna, or maybe contribution as part of that conversation. All right, show of hands.
Yeah. Lots of questions. That's great. That means you're awake. That's good for me.
Thank you for your very stimulating. My name is Wilfred Marube from Kenya. Thank you for your very stimulating topic and engagement. While I was listening to you, I was struggling a bit in terms of reconciling the contradictions, especially if you look at the relations between what the African taxpayers think of China and what China probably expects us to think about them. And I was just wondering, from where you sit, having that experience, how would African governments, suppose, assuming maybe Kenyan government, how would it probably communicate to its citizens regarding their very negative perceptions about the Chinese experience? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a really important question, and I kind of wish the Ghanaian Minister of Information was still in this room, because what we have been saying to African governments is that they not only need to actually get a handle on the Chinese relationship, they also need to publicly share that. They need to say, this is where our relationship with China is going, this is what we want to get out of it, and be accountable for that. I think part of the challenge with China is, it is, and I say that distinctively from, I was talking about making comparisons with other development partners, but because the impact of China is so obvious to taxpayers, right? You see it. Thika Road was the first big Chinese project, right? Or well, even the stadium back in 1980s. But you really see the impact of China. So taxpayers see that, they care about it, they worry about it, and they talk about all of the things that were mentioned at the beginning. If governments aren't saying, this is what we're trying to get out of this relationship, it's very difficult for them to handle it. And very difficult for, which is why, that's why I brought out that Ethiopian example, because Ethiopia, and it's struggles, of course, as all governments do. Ethiopia has been very deliberate about its Chinese strategy. It has been very clear about what role it wants it to play, communicated that to the public, communicated, like I said, in the newspaper about what the amount of laborers are going to be. That's taking responsibility. It's being accountable for the relationship, even at a high level. It's really crucial.
Next question.
Thank you so much. My name is Francis, again from Kenya. I'm a founder of a company called Torex Global, dealing with tourism technology. My question is, UNWTO statistics of 2018 put China as the leading spender in global tourism, at 277 billion.
Sorry, could you say that a bit louder?
Oh, sorry. So I'm saying UNWTO statistics of 2018 put China as the leading tourism spender globally, actually beating all the five, it's total combination of all the top 5 spenders globally cannot even beat China. The question is, how do we position ourselves as Africa to tap into that spending? And it's do actually Chinese visit China, and what do we need to offer to them to actually be able to get this spending spent in Africa? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you got that, Hannah.
I did, yes,
Okay.
about tourism. It's a really important area. Again, you know, if there's 3 things that a lot of governments are trying to work with China on, tourism is definitely one of them, a massive priority. If you go to most tourism fairs in China, you will definitely see a few African countries at least promoting their destinations. So they're spending, they're trying to market for sure. But at the same time, it's also really challenging to bring Chinese tourists to Africa. One is about perceptions of the continent, and different destinations as well. The perceptions still need to be changed about what Africa is, and what different countries have to offer. Accessibility is another one. That's why that article from Quartz Africa was very interesting, because it actually shows what are the different destinations that are easily accessible for China. But also, it's a question of who are you marketing to in China? And what we tend to do as African countries, and I've seen in the marketing, is it's very, very broad, very simple. The majority, at best, is just translated of the normal material that we would market to the UK, to the US. We have very little understanding of the Chinese consumer. And the Chinese consumer is different in many cases, and there are lots of different types of Chinese consumer. Are you trying to attract a high-end Chinese tourist? Are you trying to attract the group of Chinese tourists? So even the marketing itself is really is not strong enough. And then finally, when you get to actually bringing tourists, what Chinese tourists often feel very comfortable with is having a Chinese tour operator. And part of that is because they kind of know what Chinese tourists want. They will want to have a little bit of Chinese food, not necessarily all the time, but they definitely will want to have a little bit of home comforts. The language barrier is an issue. Sometimes they travel in groups. The high-end tourists are not traveling in groups so much anymore, and so on. So there's a whole range of different. They love to take photos. I mean, group photos, flowers, etc. Any beautiful image that you can find, and make sure that they can get a photo, whether it's real or not, it doesn't matter. Whether it's just created for that purpose. So there's a lot of understanding. We just have not communicated and worked with Chinese stakeholders enough to be able to understand what they need. So there's a lot of education, a lot of better understanding of the Chinese tourists that we need to do in order to attract. And we have to decide who are the Chinese tourists that we're looking for.
Okay, question?
All right, and thanks so much for the opportunity, for the insightful presentation. My name is Ferdy from Lagos, Nigeria, Imaginero. So I play at the intersection of media, entertainment, and technology. But interestingly, China's play in Africa has always been in infrastructure and largely somewhere around manufacturing. But in the last few years, we're seeing them move to have interest in media, entertainment, and technology. And really, there is a culture war.
Yes.
Whether or not we admit it, we're actually caught in the tension between the West and China, right? And it's something that we just have to navigate carefully. One of the major challenges I want you to speak to is, in Africa, we have very weak bilateral trade agreements, almost non-existent, particularly in intellectual property or media, entertainment, and technology sector. Okay. And for instance, I'm in production, making a movie with a Chinese company, but there is no co-production treaties. So it's likely to benefit them than it will benefit us.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through the mind of a Chinese investor that is looking at this media, entertainment, and technology space? How do we deal? What are the red flags we need to look out for? And really...
Yeah, those are some really big red flags. And again, there's no easy answer to it. Definitely, the type of engagement from China has been shifting, as you say. There's definitely been infrastructure at the beginning, even certain types of infrastructure projects. The way that China's engaging in infrastructure projects is also changing. And then they're also looking into new areas. They're looking into manufacturing. They're looking into first of all, distribution of products, and then potentially manufacturing, and their industrial parks are being created so that there's more manufacturing. But looking at Africa as a real market for their products. There's the example of Tecno, or Transsion is the main company, who dominate the smartphone market. They produce here, never sold a smartphone in China, ever. They produced only for the African continent. Also investing in Boomplay, I think it's called. So they're having a big influence, but it is on the part of our governments to try and make sure that they are well equipped to be able to deal with those. These are relationships which we haven't had with other development players before, necessarily. And it offers an opportunity because it's investment, but at the same time, we also need to be protecting our intellectual property and our businesses, making sure that the taxes raised from new factories are going into the taxpayers and being recycled into the economy. A great place to learn about what those structures should be is China. China has been very, very protective of its internal market, of its domestic market, for a very long time. The whole discussion with the US and China is all about the degree of protection between the US and China. So actually, we are speaking to the perfect partners, in a sense, to be able to try to get as much out of that relationship as possible. But there's examples. China has still managed to get out of the poverty trap while protecting its domestic industry. I think as an African continent, as African countries together, and especially with the free trade arrangement, we have an opportunity to create those rules. And we should be putting pressure as well on the African Union to be doing that for us and to be prioritizing the China relationship in this sense.
Okay, we have a final contribution here.
Hi, I'm Tim Morris, and Henry and friends have very kindly allowed me as a guest here to ask a question. I'm a friend of Africa, not an African, and I've been here for the last 10 years. I'm also old enough to remember a time when we weren't concerned about China at all. I spent the first 11 years of my career in Japan, which was a subject of considerable fear and ignorance. And I can only commend you, Hannah, for the job you're doing. I think it's adventurous and it's incredibly necessary to explain realities of what's happening in China to all of us, because there is an information gap and you are filling it. My question is about the future. The question on my mind the whole time thinking about China, and I come from a country which effectively wants to be positive about cooperation with China in third countries and in Africa, is where do you think it's going? And I, of course, appreciate China is not a single entity, but we've seen a surge at very rapid pace through the last years of involvement in Africa, driven by certain objectives you can perhaps very quickly describe. But I'm really interested about what it's going to look like in 2030, 2040, 2050. Are we, and I, of course, appreciate it's a political question in China, and it's a question about the way China develops. But what's your take on it? Is it going to be a more entrepreneurial, a more private sector approach to Africa? Is it going to be one, therefore, which will enable other partners to work with China in Africa? Or do you see more of the same, or even perhaps decline? Perhaps the resource picture globally will change, the need for raw materials will decline. What do you think the future looks like?
Right. Great question, and an important one, because we also, I think, also there's an African perspective on what is the future as well, and how do we engage China in that. I think from within China, of course, we know about things called the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which is a kind of continuation of the Chinese going out strategy, which started back in the 80s, but has certainly accelerated well beyond what the initial engagement was, which was effectively based on state-owned enterprises going out first. And state-owned enterprises, you know, you might have heard of some of them, you know, China Road Bridge Incorporation, CCCC, all of these large, huge entities going and doing projects, infrastructure projects in particular, and getting new business as a result, you know, and they were and are subsidies for them to do that, for them to take Chinese laborers abroad as well, you know, and to get those projects done on behalf of other governments or on behalf of the banks and others. That was the first stage, and alongside that was also a drive, because China was still at that point the global manufacturing house. You also had a drive to bring natural resources from other countries, including African countries, to China to then be processed into manufactured goods. But the future in China is one of rising domestic consumption. There's a good reason why certain brands are definitely interested in the Chinese market. Last year, if you think about the retail sector, the US retail sector, I think, grew by about 2%. In China, it grew by 16%, right? So there's a massive driver. It's growing really fast. And of course, foreign companies it's a challenging environment to compete, but at the same time, it's a growing market. But China doesn't want to be the manufacturing house of the world anymore. And that can move. There's an opportunity for that to move to the African continent. But if it does, then you also need to have good logistics between not just Africa and the EU or US. You also have to have good logistics between Africa and China, and also Latin America, that's a much bigger project. And it means that the infrastructure projects that China has been willing to invest in by, you know, bringing in low interest rates and so on, concessional loans for these big infrastructure projects, are to some degree in its own domestic interest. That's why it describes it as win-win. But again, it's up to the African continent to be able to, and African leaders, citizens, to put pressure on leaders to try to take advantage of that as much as possible. And not just in terms of bringing the overall manufacturing, it's also things like regulating the manufacturing to make sure it's environmentally friendly, making sure that the products that do come in are up to standard. And there are opportunities as well for international partners to work with those trends, not to push against them, but to work with those trends and to accelerate them as well as possible. We're involved in some of those projects. We're working in Kenya and Ethiopia at the moment, but there's great potential for many more of those types of kind of what we call trilateral cooperation projects, and they're at a business level and also at a government level. So thank you. Thanks for that question.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Anna Ryder, Chief Executive Officer, Development Reimagined in China. Thank you so much, Anna. May I ask Perez, please, could you join Anna on stage for one photo opportunity? Thank you so much. A round of applause once again for Anna Ryder. And of course, by transfer of that applause for Perez, bringing everyone together on the continent and outside of the continent to speak for Africa. Thank you so much, Perez. Right, Anna's points were really, really valid, especially with Africa being caught in between two world powers, talking about the West collectively and China with vast interest. But one thing we can infer is that Africa markets on its own offer a vast investment opportunities driven by prospects for the future growth. And as we speak for Africa and continue to speak for Africa, we trust that we will begin to find our own voice, even though we've never been voiceless. But Anna also mentioned three key points, or three key pointers as communication experts that we must really take to heart. And she did mention for us to be careful of selecting the language. As we think to change the narrative about Africa, we must also be very careful about selecting the right language to tell the stories. Always contextualize, very important point to note. And the third point was and is make cross-country comparisons. So even as we sort of engage with the narrative within the continent, we must also engage this sort of 3 pointers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I know that on the program we did highlight that we are to engage in a presentation with the team from Leo Burnett, Nigeria. But imagine this. I'm sure you must have come across a particular video that keeps playing intermittently during breaks, which has a masquerade dancing. Now, that masquerade in my country, I come from Nigeria, in my country is called Eyo masquerade. And it is very iconic. It's a symbol and it's a representation of a particular ethnic group in Nigeria. And the Eyo masquerade is phenomenal with its characteristics. And for a company such as Leo Burnett to come up with a very interesting twist of making the Eyo masquerade dance in a contemporary way, even though it captures the essence of its dance and rhythm, it will be interesting to also find out what they have to unpack in their session. But because of time, and of course I know it's been a long day spent, we actually apologize that we have to move that session till tomorrow. And we are going to engage more with that. Thank you, thank you. That's the video I'm talking about. So just imagine the creativity that has gone into this video. Now imagine the content they will be unpacking. So I think it's best we all go back, relax, and get ready to enjoy the session as we go into the last day of the Global Africa Forum on Communication. So far, so good. It's been an exciting day 2. There has been a lot of unpacking, a lot of brilliant conversations, and we are sure to have a very, very more engaging time tomorrow. Now, don't forget tomorrow being Friday, the 3rd and final day of the conference. We did mention also that by 7 p.m. on Friday, how many of you are looking forward to really, really enjoy moments, a social moment in Kigali? I am definitely looking forward to that. Yes. So 1000 Hills Distilleries have graciously invited us to come out to their space to enjoy a very lovely time out, 7 p.m. tomorrow. Again, we will be communicating details specifically for this cocktail reception. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you join us for day 2 on behalf of the organizers of GAFCOM 2019. And my humble self, Henry Akechukwu. It's been my pleasure being your host, and I look forward to having you engage with us tomorrow, being the final day of the conference. Again, it's going to be an early start, and we are hoping that you're making the most of the opportunities available at this conference. Please feel free to network some more, engage, and possibly book some appointments to fill up your time later this evening. We ask you to please have a very, very lovely evening. Thank you so much, and see you in the morning. Thank you.